In the heart of Chicago, a city known for its towering skyscrapers and bustling streets, Detective Mark Harris was a name people recognized. To many, he seemed like the epitome of law enforcement, a man who worked tirelessly to keep criminals off the streets. But those who knew him well understood that his methods weren't always above board. Harris had a reputation for cutting corners when it suited him. He believed that as long as he got results, the means didn't matter. And, so far, his tactics had kept him out of trouble. One chilly evening, Harris found himself patrolling the quieter side of town. The streets were dimly lit, and the air carried a faint chill. It wasn't unusual for him to be out here. These neighborhoods often saw their share of suspicious activity. As he drove down a narrow road, his eyes caught sight of a car parked near an alleyway. Something about it felt off. For one, the vehicle matched the description of a car spotted near a recent bank robbery, a sleek black sedan with tinted windows. Harris decided to investigate further. He pulled up behind the sedan and turned on his flashing lights. The driver's door opened slowly and out stepped a woman. She appeared calm, almost too calm for someone being stopped by the police. Her dark hair was tied neatly into a ponytail, and she wore a simple jacket over jeans. There was nothing particularly remarkable about her appearance, but Harris sensed something beneath the surface. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, directly without flinching, or perhaps it was just his gut instinct telling him she might be hiding something. "Good evening, ma'am," Harris said, approaching her with a clipboard in hand. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" The woman shook her head politely. "No, officer, I haven't done anything wrong." Harris smirked inwardly. People always said they hadn't done anything wrong even when they were guilty. He glanced at her license plate and then back at her face. "Can I see your driver's license and registration, please?" She complied, handing over her documents without hesitation. Harris studied them carefully. Her name was Sarah Collins, and according to the ID, she lived in a suburban neighborhood not far from the city. Everything seemed legitimate, but Harris wasn't convinced. He asked her a series of questions. Where was she coming from? Where was she headed? Did she have any connection to the bank robbery reported earlier that day? Sarah answered each question, calmly and truthfully. She explained that she had been visiting family and was now heading home. When pressed about the robbery, she denied any involvement, saying she had no idea what he was talking about. But Harris wasn't satisfied. He had already made up his mind. This car was too similar to the one described in the robbery report, and he needed someone to pin the crime on. His superiors were breathing down his neck to solve the case quickly, and Sarah seemed like the perfect candidate. What Harris didn't realize, however, was that Sarah wasn't just an ordinary citizen. Beneath her composed exterior lay years of training and experience. She was, in fact, Special Agent Sarah Collins, a high-ranking operative within the FBI's Organized Crime Division. On leave for personal reasons, she had been driving home after spending time with loved ones. Though she could have easily revealed her true identity and ended the encounter right there, something stopped her. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe a desire to understand how far Harris would go to frame an innocent person. Whatever the reason, she chose to play along. As Harris continued questioning her, Sarah noticed small details that betrayed his intentions. His tone grew increasingly aggressive, and his questions became more accusatory. He began implying that she must have been involved in the robbery, despite having zero evidence to support such claims. Sarah listened intently, filing away every word he said. She knew how to read people, and Harris's behavior screamed desperation. He wanted this arrest badly, and it showed. When Harris finally announced that he was taking her in for further questioning, Sarah didn't resist. Instead, she cooperated fully, knowing that her compliance would only strengthen her position later. Inside the squad car, she sat quietly, observing everything around her. Every conversation Harris had over the radio, every detail he jotted down, it all mattered. Sarah's mind raced as she pieced together his motivations and anticipated his next moves. Back at the station, Harris wasted no time building a case against her. He fabricated stories, claiming that witnesses had identified her as the getaway driver and that her fingerprints would surely turn up at the crime scene. He even went so far as to suggest she had resisted arrest violently, despite the fact that she had been nothing but cooperative. Meanwhile, Sarah remained silent, letting him dig his own grave. She knew better than to reveal her true identity prematurely. Timing was everything, and she intended to strike at the perfect moment. As hours passed, Harris grew more confident in his fabricated narrative. He truly believed he had cracked the case wide open. Little did he know, the woman sitting across from him was far more dangerous than he could ever imagine. Sarah Collins wasn't just fighting for her freedom. She was preparing to dismantle an entire system of corruption, starting with Detective Mark Harris himself. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Rows of wooden benches creaked as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, while curious onlookers whispered to one another, trying to piece together what had brought this seemingly ordinary woman to stand trial for a high-profile bank robbery. At the center of it all sat Sarah Collins, calm and composed, her hands resting gently on the table in front of her. To anyone watching, she looked like just another defendant, nervous, maybe even scared. But beneath her serene exterior, Sarah's mind was working tirelessly, calculating every move. Detective Mark Harris took the stand with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. He adjusted his tie, glanced at the jury, and cleared his throat before launching into his testimony. Harris painted a vivid picture of Sarah as the mastermind behind the robbery, spinning a tale so detailed that it almost sounded believable. According to him, Sarah had been spotted driving away from the scene moments after the crime occurred. Surveillance footage allegedly showed her car speeding through nearby streets. Even more damning, he claimed her fingerprints were found inside the stolen getaway vehicle. The prosecutor nodded approvingly, hanging on to every word as if Harris were delivering gospel truth. But Sarah wasn't fooled. She watched Harris closely, noting the subtle smirks and exaggerated gestures he used to sell his lies. Every accusation he made was calculated to sway the jury against her, but Sarah knew better than to react. Instead, she leaned back slightly in her chair, letting her public defender handle the initial questions. Her lawyer, a young man named Daniel who had never handled a case quite like this, did his best to poke holes in Harris's story. However, Harris remained unfazed, brushing off inconsistencies with practiced ease. As the trial progressed, Harris doubled down on his accusations. When asked about the alleged resistance during the arrest, he described a violent struggle, claiming Sarah had tried to flee and even threatened him. This particular lie infuriated Sarah internally, but outwardly she betrayed no emotion. She simply raised an eyebrow ever so slightly, as though amused by the absurdity of it all. After all, anyone who had seen the dashcam footage from Harris's patrol car would know the truth. Sarah had stood still, hands raised, fully cooperating from start to finish. What Harris didn't realize was that Sarah was using the trial itself as a weapon. Each false statement he made gave her ammunition to use later. While Daniel questioned him, Sarah subtly guided her lawyer with quick glances and slight nods, signaling which points to focus on. For example, when Harris mentioned the supposed surveillance footage, Daniel pressed him for specifics. "Can you tell us exactly where this footage came from?" Daniel asked innocently. Harris hesitated, caught off guard by the question. He stammered something vague about multiple cameras, but couldn't provide concrete details. The jury exchanged skeptical looks, their faith in Harris beginning to waver. Meanwhile, Sarah worked behind the scenes in ways Harris could never have anticipated. During breaks in the proceedings, she slipped away to make discreet phone calls, using a burner device. On the other end of the line were trusted colleagues within the FBI, individuals handpicked for their loyalty and expertise. They assured her they were monitoring the situation closely, gathering evidence to support her defense. One agent promised to dig deeper into Harris's past cases, searching for patterns of misconduct. Another confirmed they had secured access to the original police reports related to the robbery, which directly contradicted Harris's claims. Back in the courtroom, the prosecution called its next witness, a nervous-looking man named Tony, who claimed to have seen Sarah near the bank around the time of the robbery. Under oath, Tony described a woman matching Sarah's appearance walking briskly away from the area. His testimony seemed convincing until Daniel began cross-examining him. With gentle persistence, Daniel highlighted inconsistencies in Tony's account. For instance, Tony initially said the woman wore a red jacket, but photos taken at the scene showed no such garment. When pressed, Tony admitted he might have been mistaken about the color. By the time Daniel finished questioning him, Tony's credibility was shot. Throughout these exchanges, Sarah maintained her composure, occasionally jotting down notes or whispering suggestions to Daniel. Though she appeared passive to outsiders, her sharp mind was always several steps ahead. She noticed how Harris grew increasingly agitated as his witnesses faltered under scrutiny. His once smooth demeanor cracked slightly, revealing glimpses of frustration. Sarah allowed herself a small private smile. Harris was unraveling, and she intended to pull the threads until the entire facade collapsed. By the end of the second day of the trial, cracks were beginning to show in the prosecution's case. The jury looked confused, unsure whether to trust Harris's dramatic narrative or the mounting evidence pointing to reasonable doubt. Even the judge raised an eyebrow at some of Harris's more outlandish claims, prompting him to rephrase his answers multiple times. Sarah, however, remained patient. She knew better than to rush things. Justice required precision, not haste. That evening, as the courtroom emptied and the lights dimmed, Sarah stayed behind for a moment, staring at the empty witness stand where Harris had stood earlier. She felt a mix of emotions: anger at the injustice being perpetrated, determination to see it corrected, and a quiet satisfaction knowing she held all the cards. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain: Detective Mark Harris had underestimated her, and that mistake would cost him dearly. Little did Harris know the real battle was only beginning. Sarah Collins wasn't just fighting to clear her name. She was preparing to expose a web of corruption that stretched far beyond this single case. And when the time came, she would strike with precision, leaving no room for doubt or escape. As the trial entered its third day, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier. The prosecution's case, once seemingly airtight, was starting to crumble under the weight of inconsistencies and unanswered questions. Detective Mark Harris sat stiffly in his seat, his earlier confidence replaced by a growing unease. He glanced at the jury box frequently, searching for signs that they still believed him. But their expressions were unreadable. Some looked skeptical, others bored, and a few appeared outright confused. Harris shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the tide was turning against him. Sarah Collins, on the other hand, remained as calm and composed as ever. Her posture was relaxed, her gaze steady, but her mind was a whirlwind of activity. Every false statement Harris made fueled her resolve to expose the truth. She had spent years honing her ability to stay patient during high-stakes situations, and now those skills were paying off. While Harris stumbled over his own lies, Sarah quietly guided her public defender, Daniel, with subtle cues. A nod here, a whisper there. It was enough to keep the defense strategy sharp and focused. The first major blow to Harris's credibility came when Daniel revisited the supposed surveillance footage that allegedly showed Sarah fleeing the scene. During cross-examination, Daniel pressed Harris for specifics. "You mentioned earlier that there's video evidence placing Ms. Collins near the bank. Can you clarify which camera captured this footage? Was it traffic cameras, security cameras, from nearby businesses, or something else?" Harris hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of the question. He hadn't expected anyone to scrutinize his vague claims so thoroughly. After a long pause, he muttered something about multiple sources without providing concrete details. Daniel seized the opportunity, turning to the judge. "Your Honor, we request access to the original footage referenced by Detective Harris. If such evidence exists, it should be presented in court." The judge nodded, ordering the prosecution to produce the alleged video within 24 hours. Harris's face flushed red as he whispered urgently to the prosecutor, who looked equally flustered. Unbeknownst to them, Sarah already knew what would happen next. The FBI agents working behind the scenes had confirmed that no such footage existed. It was yet another fabrication designed to bolster Harris's case, and soon, the truth would come out. But the unraveling didn't stop there. Later that afternoon, the prosecution called another witness, a young woman named Lisa, who claimed to have seen Sarah arguing with someone outside the bank shortly before the robbery. Lisa's testimony seemed credible at first glance. She described the altercation vividly, down to the color of Sarah's jacket and the tone of her voice. However, Daniel approached her with the same meticulous attention to detail that had dismantled Tony's earlier account. "Ms. Lisa," Daniel began politely, "you stated that the argument took place around 3:15 p.m., correct?" Lisa nodded, nervously. "And can you describe the weather conditions at that time?" This question threw her off balance. According to official records, it had been raining heavily since mid-morning, yet Lisa claimed the sun was shining brightly during the alleged encounter. When confronted with meteorological data proving otherwise, she faltered, admitting she might have mixed up the timing. By the end of Daniel's questioning, Lisa's entire testimony fell apart, leaving the jury visibly unimpressed. While Harris struggled to hold his case together, Sarah worked tirelessly behind the scenes to gather irrefutable proof of his misconduct. Using burner phones and encrypted channels, she coordinated with her FBI colleagues who were pulling strings to uncover damning evidence. One agent managed to obtain copies of Harris's past investigations, revealing a disturbing pattern of unethical behavior. Multiple suspects had accused him of falsifying evidence, coercing confessions, and even accepting bribes to manipulate outcomes. Though none of these accusations had stuck due to lack of concrete proof, the cumulative effect painted a troubling picture. Another breakthrough came when an anonymous tipster contacted Sarah's team. The informant, a retired police officer with a grudge against Harris, provided audio recordings of the detective coaching witnesses to lie under oath. These tapes included conversations where Harris explicitly instructed people to tailor their statements to fit his narrative regardless of the facts. Sarah listened to the recordings herself, her jaw tightening with each word. She couldn't believe how brazen Harris had been, thinking he could get away with such blatant corruption. Armed with this new information, Sarah prepared to strike, back in court, but not before planting more seeds of doubt in the jury's mind. On the fourth day of the trial, Daniel introduced additional discrepancies in Harris's story. For instance, Harris had claimed Sarah resisted arrest violently, but dashcam footage clearly showed her complying peacefully. When Daniel played the video for the court, Harris squirmed in his seat, unable to explain the contradiction. The prosecutor tried to dismiss it as a technicality, but the damage was done. The jury exchanged glances, their skepticism deepening with every revelation. By now, Harris was visibly rattled. His once smooth demeanor had completely vanished, replaced by a mix of frustration and desperation. He leaned forward in his chair, whispering furiously to the prosecutor, urging them to salvage the situation. But the cracks in his case were too wide to patch. Even the judge, who had initially favored the prosecution, began raising eyebrows at Harris's increasingly erratic explanations. Sarah noticed all of this with quiet satisfaction. She knew the endgame was near, and she was ready. Behind her calm exterior, adrenaline coursed through her veins. Years of training and experience had taught her how to dismantle opponents like Harris, not through brute force, but through precision and patience. Each lie he told only strengthened her position, giving her more leverage to expose the truth. That evening, as the courtroom emptied, Sarah stayed behind for a moment, staring at the empty witness stand where Harris had sat earlier. She felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about clearing her name anymore. It was about holding Harris accountable for his actions and preventing others from falling victim to his corruption. Tomorrow, she would deliver the final blow, a revelation that would leave no room for denial or escape. Little did Harris know the real battle was only beginning. Sarah Collins wasn't just fighting to prove her innocence, she was preparing to take down a corrupt system, one lie at a time. And when the time came, she would strike with precision, ensuring that justice prevailed. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the trial entered its fifth day. The air was thick with tension, and every seat was occupied. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, Cameras clicked softly from the back of the room, and the jury sat upright, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. It was clear that something significant was about to happen. Detective Mark Harris, who had once exuded confidence, now looked pale and uneasy. He fidgeted with his tie, glancing nervously at the judge, the jury, and finally, Sarah Collins. For the first time, he seemed unsure of himself. Sarah, on the other hand, radiated quiet strength. She wore a crisp suit that accentuated her poise, her posture relaxed yet commanding. Her calm demeanor masked the storm brewing inside her, a storm of determination, justice, and years of training. As the defense prepared to present its closing arguments, Sarah leaned slightly toward her public defender, Daniel, whispering instructions. Though her voice was barely audible, her words carried weight. Daniel nodded, reassured by her guidance, and turned to address the court. But before Daniel could speak, Sarah stood up. The sudden movement drew everyone's attention. All eyes were on her as she approached the judge's bench, her steps deliberate and confident. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and clear, "I'd like to request permission to address the court directly." The judge raised an eyebrow, surprised by the unusual request but intrigued. After a brief pause, he granted it, curious to hear what Sarah had to say. She turned to face the courtroom, her gaze sweeping over the jury, the prosecution, and finally Detective Harris. Then, in a moment that sent shockwaves through the room, she removed her glasses and fixed everyone with a piercing stare. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, members of the court, and Detective Harris," she began, her tone measured but firm, "there is something I need to clarify. My name is Special Agent Sarah Collins, and I am a senior officer with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Whispers erupted as people exchanged astonished looks. Harris froze, his face draining of color. The prosecutor dropped his pen, and even the judge leaned forward, clearly taken aback. Sarah let the revelation sink in for a moment before continuing. "I allowed myself to be arrested because I suspected corruption within the police department," she explained. "Detective Harris's actions during my arrest and throughout this trial have confirmed my suspicions. What you've witnessed here isn't just an attempt to frame an innocent person. It's part of a larger pattern of misconduct." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Sarah then pulled out a folder filled with documents and handed it to the judge. Inside were copies of audio recordings, emails, and internal police reports that exposed Harris's unethical behavior. One recording captured him coaching witnesses to lie under oath. Another showed him accepting bribes to manipulate cases. The evidence was damning, leaving no room for doubt. Harris, visibly shaken, tried to protest. "This is outrageous," he blurted out, pointing a trembling finger at Sarah. "She's lying. This is all fabricated." The judge slammed his gavel, silencing Harris. "Order in the court," he barked. Turning to Sarah, he asked, "Agent Collins, can you verify the authenticity of these documents?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied calmly. "These materials were obtained through proper channels and verified by independent sources. Additionally, I have colleagues from the FBI ready to testify if necessary." The judge nodded gravely and ordered a recess to review the new evidence. As the courtroom emptied, chaos erupted outside. Reporters scrambled to file stories while prosecutors huddled together, frantically discussing their next move. Harris, meanwhile, slumped into his chair, his head buried in his hands. For the first time, he realized the gravity of his mistakes and the consequences awaiting him. During the recess, Sarah stepped outside for some fresh air. She leaned against a pillar, watching the commotion unfold. Her phone buzzed incessantly, with calls from her superiors and colleagues congratulating her on exposing Harris. But Sarah didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. There was still work to be done. Corruption like this didn't exist in isolation. It thrived in systems that tolerated it. She knew Harris was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. When the session resumed, the mood in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. The judge wasted no time addressing the new developments. "Based on the evidence presented," he announced, "it appears there are serious allegations against Detective Harris that must be investigated further. Until then, Ms. Collins, Agent Collins, is free to go." As those words echoed through the room, Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. But she wasn't celebrating just yet. Instead, she turned to face Harris, who sat slumped in his chair, defeated. "You underestimated me," she said quietly, her voice carrying both authority and empathy. "And in doing so, you revealed the truth not only about yourself, but also about the system you represent." Later that afternoon, Harris was formally arrested. His badge was stripped, and Internal Affairs launched a full-scale investigation into his conduct. The ripple effects of Sarah's actions spread quickly. Officers implicated in covering up Harris's crimes faced disciplinary measures, and new protocols were implemented to ensure transparency in future cases. The media hailed Sarah as a hero, praising her courage and dedication to justice. Back at her apartment that evening, Sarah reflected on everything that had transpired. The trial had been exhausting, both mentally and emotionally, but it had also reaffirmed her commitment to her work. She poured herself a cup of tea and settled onto her couch, flipping through case files. Despite the accolades and recognition she had received, Sarah remained humble. To her, this wasn't about personal glory. It was about protecting the innocent and holding the powerful accountable. As she sipped her tea, Sarah couldn't help but smile. Sometimes, the best way to fight injustice was to let your adversaries underestimate you until it was too late. And in this case, Harris's arrogance had led to his downfall. But Sarah knew her journey was far from over. There were still battles to fight, truths to uncover, and systems to reform. For now, though, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction, knowing she had made a difference. Little did Harris or anyone else know, Sarah Collins wasn't just an FBI agent. She was a force to be reckoned with, a woman who embodied integrity and resilience. And as long as corruption existed, she would be there to challenge it one case at a time. The aftermath of Sarah Collins's explosive revelation in court sent shockwaves through the city. Detective Mark Harris, once a celebrated figure in law enforcement, was now at the center of a scandal that dominated headlines. The media couldn't get enough of the story, how an arrogant cop had tried to frame an innocent woman only to discover she was a high-ranking FBI agent. Reporters camped outside police headquarters, courthouse steps, and even Harris's house, desperate for updates on his downfall. Meanwhile, Internal Affairs investigators worked around the clock to untangle the web of corruption Harris had woven over the years. Harris's arrest was swift and humiliating. Stripped of his badge and gun, he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his face pale and expressionless. The man who had prided himself on being untouchable was now exposed as a liar and a manipulator. His colleagues avoided him, some out of fear of association, others out of disgust. Even those who had once blindly supported him began distancing themselves, realizing they'd been complicit in his schemes. As Harris sat in a holding cell awaiting formal charges, he replayed Sarah's words in his mind. "You underestimated me." He hadn't just underestimated her. He had underestimated the power of truth and accountability. The investigation into Harris's conduct revealed a pattern of misconduct that went far beyond Sarah's case. Files upon files of falsified evidence, coerced confessions, and tampered reports came to light. Suspects from past cases came forward, claiming Harris had framed them or pressured them into pleading guilty. One man recounted how Harris had planted drugs in his car during a routine traffic stop, leading to a wrongful conviction that cost him 3 years of his life. Another described how Harris had threatened to harm their family unless they admitted to crimes they didn't commit. Each story painted a chilling picture of a man who abused his authority without remorse. Sarah's FBI team played a crucial role in gathering this evidence. Agents combed through decades of records, cross-referencing Harris's cases with complaints filed against him. They interviewed victims, witnesses, and whistleblowers, piecing together a damning dossier that left no room for doubt. Every lie Harris had told, every bribe he had accepted, every piece of evidence he had fabricated, it was all documented. By the time the investigation concluded, Harris wasn't just facing charges related to Sarah's case. He was looking at a lifetime behind bars for multiple counts of perjury, obstruction of justice, bribery, and abuse of power. While Harris's world crumbled, Sarah returned to work at the FBI headquarters. News of her actions spread quickly within the agency, earning her widespread admiration. Her superiors praised her bravery and strategic thinking, dubbing her the agent who took down corruption single-handedly. Colleagues stopped by her office to congratulate her, some shaking her hand, others simply nodding in respect. Civil rights organizations hailed her as a champion of justice, inviting her to speak at conferences and award ceremonies. But Sarah remained humble, deflecting praise whenever possible. "I didn't do this alone," she told reporters during a rare press conference. "This victory belongs to everyone who refuses to stay silent in the face of injustice. Corruption thrives when good people look away, but we have the power to stop it, if we're willing to stand up." Her words resonated deeply, inspiring countless individuals to report misconduct and demand accountability from their leaders. Social media lit up with hashtags like "Expose Corruption" and "Stand with Sarah," turning her case into a rallying cry for systemic reform. Politicians promised investigations into police practices, while activists pushed for legislation to prevent similar abuses of power. Sarah's actions had sparked a movement, one that showed no signs of slowing down. Back at the police department, Harris's downfall triggered sweeping changes. Internal Affairs conducted audits of ongoing cases, identifying other officers involved in unethical behavior. Some were fired outright, others received suspensions or demotions. New protocols were introduced to ensure transparency, including mandatory body cameras for all officers and independent oversight committees to review complaints. Training programs emphasized ethics and accountability, teaching recruits that the badge represented trust, not impunity. Despite these reforms, the damage Harris had caused ran deep. Families torn apart by false convictions struggled to rebuild their lives. Communities lost faith in the very institutions meant to protect them. Sarah understood better than anyone the long-lasting impact of corruption. That's why she dedicated herself to helping victims recover and rebuild. She partnered with legal aid organizations to provide pro bono representation for those wrongfully imprisoned. She also worked with psychologists to offer counseling services for families affected by Harris's actions. To Sarah, justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty, it was about healing the wounded. As weeks turned into months, the public's fascination with Sarah's story showed no signs of fading. Documentaries, podcasts, and news specials chronicled her journey, highlighting her courage and determination. Schools invited her to give motivational speeches, hoping to inspire the next generation of leaders. Yet despite the attention, Sarah stayed grounded, focusing on her mission rather than fame. She knew that true change required persistence, not popularity. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at the office, Sarah found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. Sitting on her balcony overlooking the city skyline, she sipped a cup of coffee and scrolled through messages on her phone. Most were from grateful citizens thanking her for exposing Harris and restoring their faith in justice. A few were from fellow agents sharing tips on ongoing investigations. One message stood out, a note from a young girl named Lily, whose father had been exonerated thanks to Sarah's efforts. Lily wrote, "Thank you for giving me my daddy back. You're my hero." Sarah smiled softly, her heart swelling with pride. Moments like this reminded her why she had chosen this path, to make a difference, no matter how hard the fight. Though Harris's arrest marked the end of one chapter, Sarah knew there were countless others waiting to be written. Corruption wasn't confined to one person or one department. It was a pervasive issue that required constant vigilance. And as long as there were people willing to exploit the system, Sarah would be there to challenge them. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more battles to fight, more truths to uncover, and more systems to reform. But Sarah welcomed the challenge. She had proven that even the most powerful adversaries could be brought down, not through brute force, but through patience, strategy, and unwavering integrity. As she gazed at the glittering city lights below, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for justice was far from over, but with people like Sarah Collins leading the charge, hope remained alive. Little did the world know Sarah's story was just beginning. Months had passed since the trial that exposed Detective Mark Harris as a corrupt officer, and life in Chicago began to settle into a new rhythm. The scandal had left an indelible mark on the city, forcing both law enforcement and the public to confront uncomfortable truths about systemic corruption. For Sarah Collins, however, the fight was far from over. While Harris's arrest brought a sense of closure to many, Sarah knew it was only one small victory in a much larger war against injustice. Her resolve burned brighter than ever, fueled by the knowledge that there were still countless individuals suffering under broken systems. Sarah returned to her role at the FBI with renewed energy. Promoted to lead a task force dedicated to rooting out corruption within law enforcement agencies, she threw herself into her work with characteristic determination. Her team consisted of hand-picked agents, men and women who shared her passion for justice and integrity. Together, they developed innovative strategies to identify misconduct, gather evidence, and hold offenders accountable. Their efforts extended beyond Chicago, reaching other cities plagued by similar issues. Every case they tackled was a step toward rebuilding trust between communities and the institutions meant to serve them. One of Sarah's first major initiatives involved partnering with independent watchdog organizations to create a national database of police misconduct complaints. This platform allowed citizens to report unethical behavior anonymously, while ensuring their claims were investigated thoroughly. It also provided transparency, allowing the public to track cases and outcomes. The project faced resistance from certain quarters. Officers' unions argued it would encourage baseless accusations, while some politicians feared backlash. But Sarah stood firm. She believed that accountability was the cornerstone of reform, and she refused to compromise. Her dedication inspired others to join the cause. Activists, lawyers, journalists, and even former police officers reached out to collaborate, each bringing unique skills to the table. One retired detective named James became a key ally, sharing insights into how corruption operated behind closed doors. His testimony helped uncover patterns of misconduct that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Another partner, a tech-savvy journalist named Elena, used data analytics to identify departments with disproportionately high rates of complaints, enabling Sarah's team to focus their resources effectively. But Sarah didn't limit her efforts to professional pursuits. On weekends, she volunteered at community centers, hosting workshops aimed at educating people about their rights and empowering them to speak up when those rights were violated. These sessions often drew large crowds, including families affected by wrongful convictions and young activists eager to make a difference. Sarah listened intently to their stories, offering advice and support where needed. To her, these interactions were just as important as any investigation. They reminded her why the fight mattered. Despite her busy schedule, Sarah made time for personal reflection. Late nights found her sitting on her balcony, sipping tea and staring at the skyline. She thought about the journey she'd been on, the risks she'd taken, the battles she'd fought, and the lives she'd touched. Each memory reinforced her belief that change was possible, but only if good people refused to stay silent. She carried this conviction with her everywhere she went, using it to guide her decisions and inspire those around her. The media continued to follow Sarah's story closely, portraying her as a symbol of hope in turbulent times. Documentaries aired detailing her takedown of Harris, highlighting not just her tactical brilliance but also her unwavering moral compass. Schools invited her to give motivational speeches, hoping to instill values of courage and perseverance in students. Though Sarah appreciated the recognition, she never let it go to her head. Instead, she used these platforms to amplify voices often overlooked, those of victims, whistleblowers, and grassroots organizers working tirelessly for justice. And the months rolled by, Sarah noticed subtle shifts in the world around her. Trust in law enforcement began to rebuild, albeit slowly. Reforms implemented in response to Harris's scandal started yielding results. Fewer complaints of misconduct, increased use of body cameras, and greater cooperation between police departments and oversight committees. Communities once wary of authority figures began engaging in dialogue, advocating for policies that prioritized fairness and accountability. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but progress was undeniable. Still, Sarah remained vigilant. She understood that corruption was like a weed. Cut it down in one place and it could sprout somewhere else if conditions allowed. That's why she pushed for ongoing education and training programs, emphasizing ethics and empathy alongside technical skills. She also advocated for mental health support for officers, recognizing that stress and burnout sometimes contributed to poor decision-making. By addressing root causes, she hoped to prevent future abuses of power. On a crisp autumn morning, Sarah received a letter that brought tears to her eyes. It was from Lily, the little girl whose father had been exonerated, thanks to Sarah's efforts. Enclosed was a drawing of a superhero wearing an FBI badge captioned, "Agent Sarah Saves the Day." Beneath the picture, Lily had written, "Thank you for being brave. You changed my life forever." Sarah pinned the artwork to her office wall, where it joined other tokens of gratitude, a reminder of why she did what she did. That evening, as she prepared dinner in her quiet apartment, Sarah reflected on the road ahead. There would always be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But she had seen firsthand what could be achieved when people came together to demand better. She thought about the young activists inspired by her story, the families reunited through her work, and the colleagues who stood beside her in the pursuit of justice. These connections gave her strength, fueling her determination to keep fighting. Sarah stepped onto her balcony, letting the cool breeze wash over her. The city lights twinkled below, a tapestry of resilience and possibility. Somewhere out there, someone was standing up to corruption, refusing to back down despite the odds. And somewhere else, another person was joining the fight, inspired by stories like hers. Change was happening. One voice, one action, one moment at a time. For Sarah Collins, the battle was more than a career. It was a calling. She had chosen to dedicate her life to protecting the innocent and holding the powerful accountable, no matter the cost. As long as there were injustices to confront and truths to uncover, she would be there, leading the charge, with quiet resolve and unshakable faith. Because in her heart she knew this. Justice wasn't just a destination. It was a journey, and Sarah Collins was ready to walk every step of the way.